Okay, it's time to introduce our speaker, who is also a former member of our club. Many of you know Mark Brewer, CEO of the Central Florida Foundation. He's been there since the year 2000, and in that time, he's helped some 150 nonprofit boards with the development of their strategies and programming. He began his career as a reporter, as an anchor, and a journalist. He has a decade of management consulting, both in private and independent sectors. He was a licensed licensed investment professional. He holds a bachelor's degree in business, a master's degree in public administration with special emphasis on nonprofit management. Indeed, a very, very significant area of our economy. And we were talking, some nonprofits need a lot of help. So with that, we could go on for a long time about his many, many accomplishments. Please welcome former member of our club, Mark Brewer.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. It's always an honor when you invite me to come and speak to the club, because Rotary, to me, is one of the best representations of what a democracy does when it does things right. So what you're doing here around scholarships and other local issues that you're focused on are important. Rotary International is a textbook case of what happens when citizens come together around a table for a meal and decide to inoculate the world against a major disease. In fact, that's never been done in any other country by anybody else in history. So I just say thank you to all of you, especially those of you who have been here for more than one generation. That says something about what makes Orlando and Central Florida a great place to live. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about philanthropy and share just a little bit around the philanthropy in Central Florida and what goes on here. And along with that, I'll share some work of the Central Florida Foundation. So when I say the word philanthropy, that immediately makes people uncomfortable, because they think philanthropy sounds like something that rich guys do and the rest of us can't really participate in that. Philanthropy isn't about how much money you give, it's about how you give the money. And it's really about bringing your head, your heart, and your wallet to a table to solve a problem, which is at the crux of our democracy. This is how we got started as Americans. So all of you know, I'll take you back to high school for just some basic civic education here, although I know you all know this. 3 sectors in the economy: public, private, and what some people call the nonprofit sector. But economists don't call it that, they call it the independent sector, because it has a very special job. The private sector, of course, its job is to create wealth, and everybody in the private sector wants to create wealth and have the other sector, the public sector, stay out of their way while they're doing it. The public sector's job is to protect the infrastructure and to take care of things that the private sector can't and shouldn't have to take care of. Thus, the two partner together frequently in order to help each other. The third sector of the economy, called the independent sector by economists, because its job is to do the things the other two sectors can't do or won't do. And the point I want to make to you here is that money drives the private sector and the public sector to even think about doing something. So if we wanted to start a business, we'd have to go find some investors, and then we'd have to talk all of you people into buying whatever widget we produced in order to make that thing work. The public sector is the same way. People complain constantly about the government not doing things they should do, but the reality is, for the government to create services and to provide things, we have to be willing to pay taxes. If you don't pay taxes, there are no services. And so those two sectors are driven by capital first, where the independent sector's job is to be innovative and creative to solve problems that will attract capital to it. Now, this gets a little difficult, right? You'll hear some nonprofits saying they can't do things because they don't have any money. Well, if you're not doing things because you don't have money, it's because you're acting like a private sector company, right? Your job is to be innovative and creative, and that's the thing that we're focused on right now in the sector. Post-pandemic, we're looking at all of the nonprofits that have complicated business models that need to be reworked. Now, you may not know the economy of this. There are about 12,000 nonprofits in the metro. They're the 4th largest employers in the region, right? Just ahead of, or just behind tourism, also just ahead of construction. So at the end of the day, the nonprofit sector is an incredibly important part of the economy because it provides social activity that's measured in a way that makes quality of life and economic development possible. You can't attract people to live here, and you can't build the kind of community you want with a vision to do things if you don't have a strong independent sector to go out and do that work. So when we think about philanthropy, you folks operate almost entirely at the retail level in philanthropy, except when you get to the foundation level. Now you're operating in systems, right? Trying to figure out how to solve more complex problems that take a lot of volunteer head, heart, and then a wallet in order to go get that done. The retail philanthropy that gets done is critical to nonprofits. It's what drives them. It's the revenue that keeps them going. But at the systems level, everything we're trying to solve for as a community needs all three sectors involved in it, and none of it is siloed. So you'll hear people talk about affordable housing and attainable housing. That's a problem. You may not know that 48% of the people who live in the metro pay 30 to 50% of their income for housing, which means however much money you make, $15 an hour or $100,000 a year, you're precariously housed if you're spending half of your income on your housing. So that's an affordable housing problem, but for people who are homeless all the way up to the people who are at the workforce income level, they have an attainable housing problem. There isn't any housing. If you earn $15 an hour, you'd have to have everybody at your table go with you to rent an apartment anywhere in downtown Orlando, because without that many roommates, you wouldn't be able to afford it. But when we go after housing, that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is transportation. And by the way, you could add into that healthcare and employment issues, which are also problematic. And so as a community, if we're not working on big complex things as a group and doing more than one thing at a time, and the thing to be careful of on the retail side of philanthropy is not to get siloed into helping in a way that doesn't provide more assistance with the larger problem. So feeding hungry people is an important thing to do, but feeding hungry people doesn't solve the hunger problem. We have to feed hungry people, but then we need to fix the hunger problem. Otherwise, we'll eventually spend all the money we have feeding hungry people, and there'll be more hungry people that we don't have money to feed. So at the end of the day, as a systems focus, philanthropy does much of that kind of work. At the foundation, we are an interesting hub of people in the community with more than 400 charitable funds, which are held there by individuals, families, and by corporations. We go after complex issues, big initiatives, and then each of those funds grants millions of dollars a year into the community for nonprofits, from retail all the way up to complex things. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at housing, one of the things we've been focused on for the last 3 years is the ability to build something into the supply side that helps people actually convert housing or to build housing or to sustain housing that continues to be affordable, right? So if I have affordable housing because you helped me, you gave me a little money and I went and rented the place, or I bought a place. Now, when I sell it to you, it goes back to market and I'm doing fine because I came out of that in pretty good shape, but it may not be affordable for you to be able to buy. So to have sustainable affordable housing takes systems that make that work. 4 years ago, the foundation, along with 2 partners, purchased 88 housing units over here in Paramore, which were on the block to be bought by a developer who would have torn them all down and built market rate housing. Because of Creative Village and UCF moving to town and the 2 sports venues and the entertainment complex, Paramore is now beginning to evolve in a way that creates gentrification for the people who may have lived there for many generations. And so some of the housing units that we purchased and renovated back to like new and then capped rent on, so that the average rent in those units is about $680 a month. Some of those people who live there have lived there for decades. There's a retired woman in one of our units that worked for Disney, retired from Disney, and has lived in the same house, renting it for 60 years. So at the end of the day, that systems problem is not to go subsidize some people so they can get affordable housing. It's not a bad thing to do, but that doesn't scale. So being able to accomplish the purchase and maintenance of more housing units. We currently are about 70,000 affordable housing units short in the metro. That's not just for poor people, that's for everybody. And if we don't fill that gap or find a way to fill the gap, it's going to create a problem for our economic development. Businesses don't want to move someplace where their employees can't afford to live. It's going to create a problem for our quality of life issues that we work on. Now, I know some of you in the private sector would say, well, hey, isn't that a free market thing? Won't that just work itself out? Well, if we lived in Boise, Idaho, it probably would, because if this table got together and we built some really expensive apartment units for $2,500 a month, and everybody in Boise looked at us and went, what, are you kidding me? I don't have $2,500 a month for that apartment. We would take a bath, lose our deal, and the apartment rents would come down. When you have 1,500 people a week who move into your metro, there are plenty of people who can afford $2,500 apartments, and developers will build for them. There's no natural market force that would suddenly say, well, okay, we need to bring rents down, because there's plenty of demand for more expensive places. So that means we have to work not just on building new housing, we have to work on renovating existing housing, keeping it affordable. And if you're aware of what happens when people build affordable housing using a tax credit, it stays affordable for 15 years, and then they can take it back to market. Well, we've got to keep that from happening, or we're going to lose 7,000 affordable housing units over the next 10 years, which means somebody needs to purchase that housing coming out of tax credits to keep it affordable by renovating it, as we did over in Paramore, and putting a cap on it. So when you go looking for big complex things, it takes all three sectors and a lot of people to focus in on that issue. 4 years ago, we recognized that this community was probably a potential hub for building social enterprises. A social enterprise is a business. It can be a private sector for-profit business. It can be a nonprofit, or it could be a mix of a nonprofit and a for-profit business, where its balance sheet is as important as its social measures. And the two have to stay in line. Because if we start not doing many social things and we can't measure it and we're making more money, then we're just a private sector business. If we start doing more social things that we can't make a profit, then we're like a nonprofit, right? So the concept is the two have to stay together. We have almost 700 social enterprises here, and the social enterprise accelerator called Rally, which is housed at Rollins in a partnership between the foundation and Rollins. That social enterprise accelerator is producing 16 early stage companies a year, which are taking off and doing great things. Here's an example. A young man from India who grew up in Kenya and was going to MIT came to the accelerator 2 years ago because he had designed a piece of technology that would allow you to cough into your iPhone and at a 94% success rate diagnose tuberculosis. Now, he's a social entrepreneur. He was excited about this because in Africa, you can't get a TB diagnosis. And if you can, you probably can't get treatment for it. So he was anxious to build this social enterprise business to take this back to India. But while he was here and building the business model and plan, healthcare professionals here told him, there you save lives, here you can save money, and we're interested in this too. Today, with some venture capital, he's now grown this business to be a substantial provider of sensor-based electronic diagnosis, and it works really well. We had 3 young men who, at UCF, interning out at the Space Coast, identified that NASA had this interesting kind of chemical mix that they use to clean up all the junk that rockets leave behind. And they got to thinking, well, if you could clean up that kind of stuff, I wonder if we could use this to go after PCBs in fresh water. Recognizing after the research that they could do it, they launched a company with almost $500 million in venture capital that's now operating from here around the world, specifically focused on getting rid of PCBs. If that's not in your backyard, the way you typically do that is to dig the dirt up and then take the PCBs out of the dirt and transport it. Meanwhile, everyone around you is getting sick, and this costs a fortune. This is a relatively low-cost way to get this done. Social enterprises will be a way to build our economy and to make certain that while we're creating jobs, we're also at the same time creating some social, measurable, impactful outcomes that matter in the community. I have to say that when I look around philanthropy here, what I'm seeing is a lot more people who are more focused this year than last on outcomes, right? So in philanthropy, we measure things in a unique way. When you make a gift to somebody, you might measure the outputs they create. How many kids did they serve? Were the kids happier when they got out of the program than they were when they went into it? These are all good things, but these are outputs. An outcome is, how is that child different? How is that child sustainably going to be different after what we did for him or her? And if you can create outcomes, then long-term you'll create impact, which by the way is measured backward using regression analysis. You can't be impactful with one gift. So you do something for a period of time, then you look back on it and you can say, yeah, we actually trended, we moved the needle to make it happen. The foundation established last year a set of impact investment philanthropy funds called Thrive, Central Florida, that focus on healthcare, education, livability, and economic stability. And those funds are collecting philanthropic dollars to make investments in pilots and strategies that can be scaled once we know they work and can be shared with other people around the country. So the concept here is philanthropy is also risk capital. There are things that we might want to try, but we're not sure of, that a funder would never fund. You might not want your money going into something that might work or it might not work. Certainly if Orange County or the city of Orlando funds something, if they're not sure it's going to work, they're not going to fund it. And so philanthropy becomes risk capital so that we can test the boundaries of things, see if they work, and then put them out to make them operational at a lower cost, reducing costs, improving the outcome measures. So when you think about the foundation, or you think about philanthropy, think in terms of the strategy that's attached to it. We all give, that's a part of democracy. If you give, you're a donor, you're a contributor, you're a helper. That's good, that's democratically possible. But the problem is, if you're only contributing but not engaging, if your head and your heart aren't with your wallet, then the outcomes will be short-term and you're likely not to see a big impact from the work that you do. So as you move along the continuum to be more strategic, asking questions about what outcomes do people have, who's working together against the same issue, so that we don't have a lot of people working in silos going after different things in the same way or going after the same things with different approaches with no collaboration or sharing of data. So the foundation spends a lot of time helping to fund and build systems that do that kind of work so that the community can find better ways to work together as they move forward. As an individual philanthropist, you're in your best spot right now because your choice of ways to be a philanthropist here through Rotary, whether it's a local retail philanthropy gift to help somebody get something done here, or it's helping the international folks move the needle for the work that they're doing. Either way, that gives you literally an allocation of things that you can approach. You can be involved in all of them or some of them, but the key is to identify the things that actually produce outcomes and make sure that the dollars you're putting into things make a difference in the way you want them to. The last thing I would tell you about philanthropy in general is that we're getting better at it in Central Florida. So you know that Orlando is kind of like a teenage city. I can't really say that to most of the people in here because you're multi-generational, right? My wife is a 6th generation Floridian. She keeps reminding me that no matter how long I'm here, I'll never actually be a resident. At the end of the day, Orlando has always been a place with a lot of movement through it and around it. We're very entrepreneurial. If you're aware of what the measure of social capital is the measure of how you act civically in your community, right? So do you vote? Do you go to public meetings? Do you communicate with your elected officials? Do you make gifts to charity? Are you willing to speak and work with people around you to talk through problems and then find solutions for them? We rank 49 out of 50 in the state of Florida. Now, that doesn't mean that we're mean people or that we don't have any social capital. It just means we're busy. We're doing other things. So the foundation has a project once a year that's working out quite nicely called Table Talk. And it's a place where on a single day, there's between 4,000 and 7,000 conversations that go on the same day. You could be a facilitator of one. You just invite some friends around a table, have a drink, have lunch, sit in the backyard and talk about things. And there are 3 questions that drive the process. What do you like best about where we live? What would you like to see change? And what are you willing to lead to make a difference? Once they've had this discussion, they all fill out surveys and bring us data, which we turn around and share with community leaders, because you may know that across the community, there are all kinds of community leaders in conference rooms with white pads doing strategy for the community, but they're not really hearing from people in neighborhoods or people in communities. And so ironically, the 2 sides are not far apart except for the way they think about these issues. As you might imagine, community leaders take on a much bigger view of things where some problems can be solved a lot easier if you just solve it at the neighborhood level instead of trying to solve it at the wholesale level. So the foundation makes grants after those community conversations. When we see, as people have the conversations, they apply, they say, we come up with something, we just need a little money, or we need a connection, or we need some influence, or we need some other people that we can talk to about this, and the foundation will bring that around for those folks. And we've been able to develop some very interesting neighborhood-based things, including something that deals with bringing capital to small Black-owned businesses who have an issue with access to capital. They have a hard time getting to it because there's some things built into the system that makes it difficult. And so we've identified how to fix that problem, and working with the city of Orlando, we're now looking at ways that we can collect the data necessary to figure out where the light spots are and then see if we can fix them. Orlando has a long history of doing good things. We also have a long history of doing not so good things. I'm sure you all know what redlining is. That's the process of redlining neighborhoods so that mortgage providers can determine who they don't want to have mortgages from their banks and finance companies. The city of Orlando was redlining long before the rest of the country was. Now, we don't do it anymore, but all of that is still in the system. Many of you may own houses that have a covenant in your deed that says you can't sell it to a person of color. Now, today you would look at that covenant and you just ignore it, but it's still in the paperwork. So trying to solve for some of these problems is about making the system not lean in a direction that creates problems for some of the community, and figuring out how we can drive capital through all systems to get to the people who need it in the places they need it in a more efficient way. And so as you can see, some of this is really private sector territory, some of this is public sector, government territory, and some of it is only independent sector territory. But the key is the independent sector is the only sector that has the ability to bring all the sectors together. When the private sector tries to convene, that becomes competitive. It's difficult sometimes. When the public sector tries to convene, that becomes driven by money most of the time. People come to the meetings if there's something in it, but if there's not, it's really tough to get people to come around a table and work through problems. But if you can get people from all three sectors together and you can get them to talk about things from their own perspective, that's called authentic leadership, then we have ways to solve most of the most complex social problems that we've got. I just want to say thank you to all of you because you do this every day. And as part of this club, you've done this for years. And it's your spirit that we need in the community. Philanthropy is not about how much you give, it's about how you give and how you bring your own intellectual quality to the table to solve problems. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to spend a few minutes with you.
Thank you, Mark. Questions, if I may. Captain.
Thank you so much for your explanation. It's the clearest I've heard in a long time for philanthropy. And we appreciate the work that you have done on behalf of our organization over the years. So you spoke a lot about housing, which I believe is the number one basic problem that we're going to face, and it's going to get worse. Has the foundation had any conversations with people or groups or government entities about bridge housing, like sheltainer companies, pallet shelters, those kinds of things? That's my first question. And then I just want to make a comment before you go into that. We just sealed a deal with Osceola County Commissioners. It was $800,000 of seed money to, it's called Pathway to Housing, that in a year will have 25 families in Osceola County purchase their homes within a year. So we're excited about that, and we'll let you know what's happening.
Please do.
But if you could talk about bridge housing, sheltainer, pallet shelters, those kinds of issues.
Sure. So right now there's a lot of thought going on around how can we recreate housing other than the way we think we've always known it. And some of the things the captain's talking about are things that right now are way off the list for jurisdictions, right? They feel like it would damage their master plans, right? Container housing is something they all love to talk about, but they don't like to do it because they think it takes up too much real estate. And so I think what you're going to see is you're going to see some pilots over the next couple of years, and that's the breakthrough piece. Osceola County is probably the county that is most interested in doing unique things. But Orlando and Orange County aren't too far behind. They just have to see it, right? Everybody has to see one bill before they go, okay, I'm willing to put that into the master plan and let people do it. You're willing to do it. I'll keep that in mind. Thank you.
Okay, Judd, I'm sorry.
I'd like to make a statement about something and also ask you a question. I was in banking since 1973 through 93. And then even in my current job, you know, we make a lot of loans to people on homes. I've never seen any redlining at all. First person I ever saw get turned down for a loan was me, right out of college. And they thought that I might be too house poor,
Right.
you know, and I wouldn't be able to keep the place up. We still figured a way to get the loan and buy the house.
Right.
But I've never seen that. I've seen anything, I've seen the banks
it's mostly
bend
here in the
over
Paramore.
backwards.
Mostly here in the Paramore area.
But anywhere, anybody that came in for a loan, if they qualified, which is under federal regulations, then they got a loan. It doesn't matter where they were, who they were. And again, first person I saw right away when I went into banking, they got turned down was me.
Good.
And I was actually making real good money, but I was supporting my wife in college. But the other thing, that's kind of interesting. I always thought, because I was so steeped in real estate, that everybody should own a home and they'd be a better citizen if they owned a home. But actually, a lot of people can't really own a home. They can't afford to keep the home up. You see elderly people that their homes are completely dilapidated because they can't afford to repair the roof. They can't afford to have irrigation for the yards. And so how do you need to define that. Do you define whether people can actually own it and keep the property up over time, not just make the mortgage? Do you do that? Do you qualify them in that manner?
Yeah, so there are a couple of strategies right now around that. One of them is to use a land trust strategy, which we've rolled out a housing trust in the metro. A housing trust, when you buy a home in a housing trust, it's like buying a condo. You own everything above ground. You don't own the real estate. You pay a small rental fee. Maintenance is done, in that case, by the housing trust. And then when you sell the house, you get some of the equity, but you share it with the housing trust so that when I buy it, it's more expensive than when you bought it, but it's not market. Right, right. So the concept is we're always looking for ways that you can house people and then keep them within their means to stay housed. Because the traditional way of doing it is over the heads of people's income in some cases.
Would that replace their air conditioner unit if it went out?
No, not likely, but the housing.
That's another thing, a lot of people, that happens, they can't afford the $7,000.
Yeah, no, look, I understand that. When we bought these housing units over here in Paramore, there were people paying more for utilities than they paid for their rent because they had holes in the windows or they had an air conditioning unit that didn't work. And so having to replace all of that equipment to make it work better and to reduce utility costs, that helps them make the rent, right? It's a good thing.
Thank you, Mark, for the presentation. So on this pamphlet here, it mentions that you accept a wide range of assets for investment. Could you just briefly go into, how you guys are leveraging IRAs and some of these life insurance? And you kind of just talked about the real estate trust, but if you could just kind of go into that aspect.
Sure.
Please.
So in philanthropy, most of the time philanthropists don't write checks. It's not that they never do, but typically they're using assets to make gifts because it's better from a tax perspective to do that. So if they're giving stock, mutual funds, private equity, which is a special kind of instrument, IRAs are an interesting opportunity. So if you are 70 and a half or older and you have an IRA that has a distribution each year, and you don't need that distribution for some reason, you can actually make that distribution to a fund at the foundation, and you can do that for up to $100,000, for which there's no tax deduction for you because it's already in an IRA, but it also doesn't come to you and you're not paying taxes on the distribution. So that's a way that people sometimes get connected to do those things. We take gifts of real estate, which is not unusual, sometimes for use, sometimes just for liquidation, to turn into cash. Right, that's correct. That's correct. And so people do that. Also, people do something called a life estate. So you might get to a certain age where you recognize that the kids are gone and it's just you and you want to live here until you're gone. So you make a life estate gift in which you get to live in the house and you have to care for the house, but you get a tax deduction, tax break for doing that. And then at your death or before, the real estate transfers to the foundation and then it's liquidated, usually to go into a charitable fund that is your legacy. That will make grants the way you want it to make grants going forward. that make sense?
Mark, I'm over here.
Oh.
I don't mean this as a critical question, but you've been working on this now for 20-some years. What is your assessment of how our community is responding to the kind of programs that you're advocating? And are we making appropriate progress in an appropriate time frame?
So I can make the argument that there's never appropriate speed, right? We put together really complex initiatives sometimes that we want to move fast, but the world doesn't always change at the rate that you want it to change. I think we're doing better now than we ever had. You made note of the fact that we at the foundation had a really unique moment in December when the president of Luminar made a $70 million gift to the foundation because he wants to work in some of these spaces. Now, he could have put that gift in Silicon Valley, which is the other place his company does business. It's located here. He lives here. But he thought Silicon Valley had enough philanthropy for the moment, and he wanted to make sure that we had a start, and he wanted to try to persuade other entrepreneurs that when it's time to cash out, don't take your money and leave town, right? Do something here. This young man, by the way, is the youngest billionaire in America. He's worth $2.5 billion. He's only 26 years old.
Any other questions for Mark? Yes. I want to zoom in.
Sure. Question is, how do you tell your philanthropists and your donors sort of like their return on investment? What happened? You know, they gave money, they gave an asset. How was that used? How do you communicate that back to them?
So each one is different. It depends on what measures you want to see. If you visit our website and you look at the Thrive project, you'll be able to see dashboards on the entire community and how things, trend data for how things are moving. So some people want to move trend data. They want to give to nonprofits where these things will get fixed. Or some of them want more focus on what's the nonprofit going to do that's going to make the community better. That's a different set of measures. So outputs, outcomes, and impact are all measures that we apply depending on the philanthropist and how they want to measure it.
My question kind of goes along with what he was just saying. You know, if we get really good at providing all this affordable housing, do we attract more people to our area that need more affordable housing? And also, when you look at, we have so many people immigrating into the country illegally, which I'm sure they need affordable housing. I mean, it's like we're digging the hole deeper and deeper. And again, if we get really good at it, then they're not dumb. They come here for more affordable housing. Is that, I mean, that's a...
Well, that would be a problem I would stay up late worrying about after we found 70,000 housing units to solve for the people who are here now who don't have affordable housing. That's a conversation I think everybody has, right? The thought is if you get really good at helping people, will more people come that need help? And you got to think through that. Everybody's got a point of view.
Thank you, Mark. Great to have you with us. Please accept this.